The marble corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio echoed with the measured footsteps of Niccolò Machiavelli as he penned what would become the most controversial treatise on power ever written. Yet beyond the political machinations that made the prince infamous lies a deeper truth about the nature of masculine strength, one that transcends mere political authority and speaks to the fundamental architecture of personal power. In the shadows of Renaissance Italy, where betrayal was currency and weakness meant death, Machiavelli observed a pattern among those who not only survived but thrived. These men possessed something beyond mere cunning or brutality. They had achieved what the ancient Stoics called autarky, complete self-mastery. They had systematically destroyed every vestige of weakness within themselves until they became, in essence, unbreakable. This is not a story of tyrants or monsters, though it may speak to the darkness that exists within all men. Rather, it is an examination of how true power is cultivated from within, how strength is forged through the deliberate elimination of internal weakness, and how men who master themselves become masters of their destiny. The weak man seeks to control others to compensate for his inability to control himself. The powerful man controls himself so completely that external control becomes unnecessary. Others naturally align with his will because they recognize authentic strength. Part 1: The Architecture of Inner Weakness. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as Lorenzo de' Medici received news of another betrayal within his inner circle. A lesser man might have raged, might have ordered executions, might have revealed the festering wound of his vulnerability. But Lorenzo's face remained impassive, his breathing unchanged. Years of deliberate self-cultivation had burned away the reflexive emotions that destroy men of power. Where other men had anger, he had calculation. Where they had fear, he had preparation. Where they had ego, he had strategy. This transformation did not happen overnight. Lorenzo, like all men who achieve true power, had once been weak. The difference lay not in the absence of weakness, for all men are born weak, but in his methodical destruction of that weakness through conscious design. The first pillar of weakness that destroys men is emotional reactivity. Watch any gathering of men and observe how quickly most reveal their inner state through their reactions. A slight provokes anger. Unexpected news creates visible anxiety. Criticism triggers defensiveness. These men are slaves to their emotional responses, broadcasting their vulnerabilities like signal fires in the night. Their enemies need only watch and wait for the optimal moment to strike at these exposed nerves. Machiavelli understood this principle intimately. In his observations of Cesare Borgia, he noted how the Duke's enemies consistently underestimated him because Borgia had trained himself to show nothing. When insulted, Borgia smiled. When threatened, he appeared relaxed. When planning violence, he displayed warmth. This was not mere acting, it was the result of years spent killing the emotional impulses that make men predictable and, therefore, vulnerable. The process begins with recognition. Every man must honestly catalog his emotional triggers, those specific circumstances that reliably produce automatic responses. Perhaps it is criticism of his competence. Maybe it is being ignored or dismissed. It could be witnessing injustice or experiencing physical discomfort. The specific trigger matters less than the recognition that it exists and controls him. Once identified, these triggers must be systematically desensitized through exposure and conscious choice. This is not suppression. Suppression creates internal pressure that eventually explodes. Rather, it is the deliberate rewiring of neural pathways through repeated conscious intervention. When the trigger occurs, the trained man pauses for exactly 3 seconds, breathes deeply, and consciously chooses his response rather than allowing his conditioning to choose for him. The second pillar of weakness is need for external validation. Most men live in constant negotiation with the opinions of others, adjusting their behavior to maintain approval, avoid criticism, or project a desired image. This need makes them manipulable. Their decisions become filtered through what will others think, rather than what does the situation require. They become actors playing roles written by others rather than authors of their own narrative. The powerful man must systematically destroy this need by developing what the Stoics called preferred indifference, complete emotional neutrality toward others' opinions. This does not mean becoming antisocial or ignoring useful feedback. Rather, it means developing an internal compass so strong that external approval becomes merely interesting information rather than necessary fuel for self-worth. This transformation requires deliberate practice in disappointing others. The developing man must regularly make choices that he knows will generate criticism or disapproval, not for the sake of contrarianism, but to prove to himself that he can withstand social pressure. He might express an unpopular but truthful opinion in a group setting. He might refuse a social obligation that conflicts with his priorities. He might enforce a boundary despite others' displeasure. Each time he chooses authenticity over approval, he weakens the chains of social dependency. The third pillar is attachment to comfort and pleasure. Most men are slaves to their appetites for food, sex, entertainment, ease. These attachments create predictable patterns that can be exploited by enemies. The man who cannot function without his morning coffee, his evening alcohol, his sexual release, or his comfortable bed has given his enemies multiple points of leverage. Disrupt his routines, threaten his pleasures, and he becomes agitated, distracted, desperate. Machiavelli observed this in the downfall of many princes who lost themselves in luxury and became dependent on their pleasures. When crisis arrived, they were psychologically unprepared for discomfort and made desperate decisions to restore their comfort rather than strategic decisions to maintain their power. The solution is not asceticism for its own sake, but the cultivation of what could be called strategic asceticism, the regular voluntary embrace of discomfort to maintain psychological independence from comfort. This might mean periodic fasting to prove mastery over hunger, cold exposure to develop tolerance for physical discomfort, sexual abstinence to maintain clarity of thought, sleep deprivation to build resilience. The goal is not suffering but sovereignty, the deep knowledge that you can function effectively regardless of external circumstances. These practices must be undertaken gradually and intelligently. The man who attempts to master all his weaknesses simultaneously will likely fail and, perhaps, damage himself in the process. Rather, one pillar should be addressed at a time, with each new strength becoming the foundation for the next transformation. The process is inherently uncomfortable because it requires facing the aspects of oneself that are most shameful and protected. It demands honesty about one's limitations, fears, and dependencies. It requires acting against deeply ingrained patterns that feel natural and necessary. But this discomfort is the price of transformation. The man who cannot tolerate the temporary pain of killing his weak self will forever remain vulnerable to the permanent pain of being controlled by others. As Lorenzo stood in his chamber that evening, reading reports of political maneuvering throughout Florence, he felt no anxiety about the machinations of his enemies. Years of deliberate self-mastery had created in him a core of unshakable calm. His enemies could threaten his wealth, his reputation, even his life, but they could not touch the fortress he had built within himself. He had become, through conscious design, ungovernable from without because he had achieved complete governance from within. This is the first transformation that all men of genuine power must undergo. They must systematically identify and destroy every aspect of themselves that can be used against them by others. Only when a man has achieved mastery over his emotions, independence from others' opinions, and sovereignty over his physical needs can he begin the second phase of the journey, the cultivation of controlled power that others instinctively recognize and respect. Part 2, the cultivation of controlled force. The winter morning when Francesco Sforza received word of a rebellion in his southern territories, those present in the room watched him carefully. A usurper who had seized the Duchy of Milan through a combination of military genius and political cunning, Sforza understood that every response to crisis was a test of his authority. Lesser rulers might have immediately dispatched armies, raged about ingratitude, or displayed the anxiety that naturally accompanies threats to one's domain. Instead, Sforza set down his correspondence, finished his meal in silence, and, only then, asked for his military advisors. This measured response was not natural to him. In his youth, Sforza had been as impulsive and reactive as any warrior. But he had learned through bitter experience that power reveals itself not in the magnitude of one's response, but in the precision and timing of that response. True power moves like a predator, silent, patient, and absolutely lethal when it finally strikes. The second phase of masculine development requires the cultivation of what Machiavelli termed virtù, not virtue in the moral sense, but a particular quality of strategic excellence that combines intelligence, courage, and timing. This is the transformation from mere self-control to active power projection. The man who has mastered himself must now learn to project that mastery outward in ways that naturally command respect and compliance from others. The first element of controlled force is presence. Most men occupy space apologetically, as if seeking permission to exist. They slouch, fidget, speak quickly, and generally broadcast their internal uncertainty through their physical being. The powerful man, by contrast, inhabits his body and his environment with complete authority. His posture is erect but relaxed. His movements are deliberate and economical. He speaks slowly enough that others must focus to follow his words. He maintains eye contact long enough that others often look away first. This presence is not a performance, it is the natural expression of a man who has killed his inner uncertainty. Because he no longer questions his right to occupy space and command attention, his body naturally expresses confidence. But this transformation requires practice and conscious cultivation. The developing man must spend deliberate time training his physical presence. This begins with posture, the conscious maintenance of an upright spine and open chest regardless of his emotional state. It continues with movement, learning to walk with purpose rather than hurry, to gesture with precision rather than nervousness, to turn his head slowly rather than darting his attention like prey. Voice training is equally crucial. Most men speak too quickly, too quietly, or with too much vocal fry because they unconsciously fear taking up auditory space. The powerful man's voice comes from his core, carries clearly without being loud, and includes strategic pauses that force others to wait for his complete thoughts. He ends statements with falling intonation to project certainty rather than seeking validation through upward inflection. The second element is strategic silence. Weak men fill silence with nervous chatter, explanations, and justifications. They volunteer information that wasn't requested, clarify points that were already clear, and generally reveal their anxiety about others' thoughts through their compulsive need to manage impressions. Powerful men understand that silence is a tool of dominance. When others speak, they listen completely before responding. When asked a question, they pause before answering, allowing the weight of their consideration to be felt. When insulted or challenged, they may respond with silence so complete that the aggressor becomes uncomfortable with their own words. This strategic use of silence communicates that they are comfortable with tension, that they do not need others' approval, and that their words, when they do come, carry weight precisely because they are not wasted. Sforza had mastered this principle to an art form. In negotiations, he would often listen to an entire proposal without comment, allowing the speaker to grow increasingly nervous about his silence. Often, this discomfort would lead the other party to offer additional concessions simply to fill the void. His silence was not empty, it was pregnant with the possibility of both reward and punishment, and this uncertainty gave him tremendous leverage. The third element is emotional regulation in high-stakes situations. While the first phase of development involves eliminating reactive emotions in daily life, the second phase requires maintaining this control when the stakes are highest, when threatened, insulted, betrayed, or facing genuine danger. This is when most men's carefully constructed self-control crumbles, revealing their underlying weakness to those who observe. True power reveals itself in crisis. The man who maintains perfect composure when his business is failing, when his reputation is under attack, when his authority is challenged, demonstrates a level of self-mastery that others instinctively recognize as superiority. This recognition is not conscious, it operates at the level of animal instinct, the same mechanism by which pack animals recognize their alpha. This crisis-level emotional regulation requires systematic exposure to progressively higher-stakes situations. The developing man must deliberately place himself in circumstances where his composure will be tested: high-pressure negotiations, public speaking under hostile conditions, competitive situations where loss is possible, confrontations with aggressive individuals. Each time he maintains his emotional center under these pressures, he proves to himself and others that he cannot be psychologically broken. The fourth element is the strategic use of force. This is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of masculine power. Most men either avoid force entirely, hoping to be liked and approved of, or they use force reactively, lashing out when their buttons are pushed. Neither approach commands respect. The powerful man understands that force, whether physical, economic, social, or psychological, must be used strategically. It should be proportional to the situation, precisely targeted, and employed only after other methods have been considered. When force is necessary, it should be applied swiftly and completely, without hesitation or half measures. More importantly, the mere capacity for force must be clearly established without necessarily employing it. Others must understand, through subtle but unmistakable signals, that crossing certain lines will result in consequences that far exceed any potential benefit. This understanding prevents most conflicts from ever occurring, as rational actors choose not to provoke responses they cannot handle. Machiavelli wrote extensively about this principle in his analysis of effective princes. Those who lasted understood that it was better to be feared than loved, if one had to choose, because fear was more reliable than affection. But this fear had to be based on demonstrated capacity, not empty threats. A prince who threatened but never followed through soon found his threats ignored. A prince who followed through with extreme prejudice rarely had to threaten twice. The modern application of this principle requires careful calibration. Physical force is rarely appropriate or legal in contemporary contexts, but social and economic force remain powerful tools. The man who will publicly correct disrespectful behavior, who will end relationships that drain his energy, who will pursue legal remedies when wronged, who will use his influence to protect himself and others, this man establishes boundaries that others respect because they understand the consequences of violating them. The fifth element is the cultivation of allies and the strategic use of reciprocity. No man achieves lasting power in isolation. Even the strongest individual needs supporters, collaborators, and loyal subordinates. But the way powerful men build these relationships differs fundamentally from the approach of weaker men. Weak men seek allies through weakness, by offering themselves as useful subordinates, by agreeing with stronger personalities, by making themselves indispensable through their eagerness to please. This approach creates relationships based on dependency and submission, not mutual respect. Powerful men create allies through strength. They demonstrate their value before seeking alliances. They offer concrete benefits while maintaining their own positions. They show loyalty to those who deserve it while maintaining the clear understanding that betrayal will be met with consequences. Their relationships are contractual rather than emotional, based on mutual benefit and clearly understood terms. Sforza understood this perfectly in his rise to power. He never approached potential allies as a supplicant, but always as an equal offering mutually beneficial arrangements. When he honored these arrangements completely, he built a reputation for reliability that made others eager to work with him. When others violated their agreements with him, his responses were swift and severe enough to discourage future betrayals. As the rebellion in his southern territories unfolded, Sforza's response demonstrated all these elements in coordination. His physical presence remained calm and authoritative as he received increasingly dire reports. His strategic silence allowed his advisors to reveal their own fears and biases, giving him crucial information about their character. His emotional regulation enabled clear thinking when others around him were beginning to panic. When he finally acted, his response was swift and overwhelming. Rather than gradually escalating military pressure, he mobilized his entire available force and crushed the rebellion in a single coordinated assault. This display of power served not only to end the immediate threat but to demonstrate to all potential future rebels that defying him would result in total destruction, not gradual pressure that might be resisted or negotiated with. Most importantly, his handling of the situation created a legend that extended his power far beyond his immediate military capacity. Stories of his calm competence in crisis, his strategic brilliance, and his ruthless effectiveness spread throughout the Italian peninsula. Future challenges to his authority became less likely because potential enemies understood they were facing not just his armies, but his reputation for invincibility. This is the second transformation that powerful men must undergo. Having destroyed their internal weaknesses, they must now cultivate the external projection of strength that naturally commands respect and compliance from others. This projection is not mere posturing, it is the authentic expression of genuine capability, demonstrated through consistent action and proven results. When this cultivation is complete, the man has achieved what Machiavelli termed the lion and the fox, the capacity for both overwhelming force and subtle manipulation, used in perfect combination according to the demands of each situation. Part 3, The Unshakable Foundation. The final letter that Cesare Borgia would ever write as a free man contained no pleas for mercy, no desperate promises, no appeals to former alliances that might save him from his approaching doom. Instead, it was a cold analysis of the political situation, an assessment of various strategic options, and a series of instructions for his remaining supporters. Even facing imprisonment and, likely execution, Borgia maintained the calculating clarity that had made him the most feared man in Italy. His enemies had finally outmaneuvered him through superior numbers and political circumstance, but they had not broken him. In his final moments of power, he remained exactly what he had trained himself to become: unshakable. This represents the ultimate achievement of masculine development according to Machiavellian principles. The man who has systematically destroyed his internal weaknesses and cultivated controlled external force must finally achieve complete psychological independence from outcomes. He must become someone who can maintain his essential character regardless of whether he wins or loses, lives or dies, achieves his goals or watches them crumble. This is not resignation or fatalism, it is the profound strength that comes from deriving one's identity and worth from internal sources that no external force can touch. The path to this unshakable foundation requires understanding and implementing what the Stoics called amor fati, not merely accepting one's fate, but loving it completely. This means developing such complete confidence in one's ability to handle whatever circumstances arise that the specific nature of those circumstances becomes irrelevant. The truly powerful man is equally prepared to win or lose, to be praised or vilified, to live in luxury or poverty, because he has cultivated internal resources that remain constant regardless of external conditions. This transformation begins with the systematic separation of identity from roles and achievements. Most men define themselves through their positions, their job titles, their wealth, their relationships, their accomplishments. While these things may be valuable and worth pursuing, they cannot be the foundation of a man's sense of self because they can all be lost through circumstances beyond his control. The man whose identity depends on his role as CEO will be psychologically destroyed if he loses his company. The man whose worth is tied to his marriage will be broken by divorce. The man who sees himself primarily as successful will be shattered by failure. The unshakable man must build his identity on things that cannot be taken away: his character, his capacity for clear thinking, his ability to respond appropriately to any situation that arises. These internal qualities can be developed to such a degree that they remain constant regardless of external circumstances. The man who knows himself to be courageous does not need to prove it through external displays. The man who has cultivated wisdom does not need others to acknowledge his intelligence. The man who has achieved genuine self-respect does not require external validation to maintain his sense of worth. This process requires what could be called identity archaeology, the systematic excavation of one's true self from beneath the layers of social conditioning, parental expectations, and cultural programming that typically define personality. Most men never undertake this work and, therefore, remain forever dependent on external sources for their sense of identity. They are actors playing roles written by others rather than authors of their own character. The excavation begins with radical honesty about one's motivations. Why does he want the things he says he wants? Are these desires authentic expressions of his nature, or are they programs installed by others? Does he want wealth because he genuinely values financial security and the options it provides, or because he has been conditioned to equate money with worth? Does he pursue romantic relationships because he genuinely enjoys partnership and intimacy, or because he fears being alone and unloved? Does he seek professional success because he finds the work meaningful, or because he needs others to see him as important and accomplished? These questions have no universally correct answers. What matters is that each man discovers his own authentic responses rather than accepting default programming. The powerful man must know himself so thoroughly that his choices flow naturally from his genuine values rather than from unconscious attempts to fill psychological voids or meet others' expectations. The second element of the unshakable foundation is the cultivation of what Machiavelli called necessità, the ability to find meaning and purpose in whatever circumstances one faces, rather than requiring specific conditions to feel fulfilled. This is not passive acceptance but active transformation, the capacity to extract value, lessons, and even satisfaction from any situation, no matter how challenging or seemingly negative. Borgia exemplified this principle throughout his career. When he was forced to operate within the corrupt papal court, he became a master of ecclesiastical politics. When circumstances required military action, he developed into a brilliant field commander. When political situations demanded diplomatic finesse, he proved capable of extraordinary subtlety. He did not waste energy lamenting that the world was not as he wished it to be. He became supremely competent at operating within the world as it actually was. This adaptability requires developing multiple sources of meaning and satisfaction rather than depending on any single path to fulfillment. The man who can only be happy as a leader must suffer when forced into subordinate roles. The man who requires constant excitement will be miserable during quiet periods. The man who needs to feel useful and productive will be destroyed by forced inactivity. The unshakable man cultivates the capacity to find genuine satisfaction in contemplation, physical challenges, creative expression, service to others, intellectual pursuits, spiritual practices, and simple sensory pleasures. Because he has multiple pathways to fulfillment, the blocking of any single path does not threaten his overall well-being. He becomes psychologically robust in the way that a diverse investment portfolio is financially robust, protected against the failure of any particular component. The third element is the development of temporal perspective, the ability to maintain long-term thinking and emotional stability regardless of short-term fluctuations in fortune. Most men are psychological slaves to their immediate circumstances. When things go well, they feel invincible. When things go poorly, they despair. This emotional volatility makes them unreliable allies and predictable enemies, as their responses can be anticipated based on their current situation. The unshakable man maintains consistent emotional equilibrium because he understands that all external circumstances are temporary. Success and failure, praise and criticism, wealth and poverty, health and illness, all of these conditions fluctuate naturally over time, and attaching one's emotional state to any of them creates unnecessary suffering and strategic vulnerability. This perspective is not merely intellectual understanding but deeply embodied wisdom that comes from deliberate practice in maintaining equanimity during both positive and negative experiences. When fortune smiles, the developing man consciously reminds himself that this condition is temporary and prepares mentally for its eventual change. When fortune frowns, he reminds himself that this too shall pass and looks for opportunities that may emerge from apparent setbacks. This practice must extend beyond mere intellectual acceptance to genuine emotional integration. The man who intellectually understands impermanence but still experiences emotional turbulence during changes has not yet achieved the transformation. True integration means feeling the same essential calm during both triumph and disaster, not because he doesn't care about outcomes, but because he has developed such confidence in his ability to handle whatever comes that the specific nature of what comes becomes secondary to his response to it. The fourth element is the cultivation of what could be called strategic detachment, the ability to care deeply about important things while maintaining the emotional distance necessary for clear decision-making. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the unshakable foundation to achieve, as it requires holding two seemingly contradictory states simultaneously. The man who cares too little lacks the motivation necessary for great achievement and cannot inspire others to follow him. But the man who cares too much becomes emotional about outcomes and loses the clarity necessary for optimal strategic thinking. The unshakable man must find the precise balance point where he cares enough to be motivated but not so much that he becomes attached to specific outcomes. Machiavelli observed this quality in the most effective leaders he studied. They were passionate about their goals but dispassionate about their methods. They would sacrifice anything, including their own lives, to achieve their objectives, but they would also abandon those same objectives if circumstances made them impossible to achieve. This combination of passionate commitment and strategic flexibility made them nearly impossible to defeat because they could not be manipulated through their attachments or broken through their setbacks. Achieving this balance requires extensive practice in what could be called identity shifting, the ability to become completely absorbed in a role or goal while maintaining awareness that this is a chosen identity rather than one's essential self. The man who can throw himself completely into building a business while knowing that he is not ultimately defined by its success or failure achieves optimal performance without psychological fragility. The fifth and final element is the development of what the ancients called ataraxia, complete emotional and psychological self-sufficiency. This is the state in which a man's happiness, sense of purpose, and psychological well-being are completely independent of external circumstances or other people's actions. He may enjoy success, companionship, and favorable conditions, but he does not require them for his fundamental peace of mind. This self-sufficiency is not selfishness or antisocial behavior. The man who has achieved true ataraxia is often more capable of genuine relationships and effective action because he engages with others from a position of abundance rather than need. He can be generous because he does not fear loss. He can be honest because he does not fear rejection. He can take risks because he does not fear failure. His emotional independence actually makes him more effective in all his relationships and endeavors. The cultivation of this self-sufficiency requires systematic practice in deriving satisfaction from internal sources. This might involve developing rich inner lives through meditation, contemplation, or intellectual pursuits. It could mean finding genuine pleasure in simple activities that require no external validation, walking in nature, physical exercise, creative expression, or service to others. The specific activities matter less than their common characteristic. They must be sources of satisfaction that depend entirely on the man's own participation and cannot be taken away by others. As Cesare Borgia faced his final imprisonment, he had achieved this complete self-sufficiency. His power was gone, his allies had abandoned him, his enemies were triumphant, yet he remained essentially unbroken because his fundamental sense of self was not dependent on external validation or favorable circumstances. He had successfully separated his identity from his role, his worth from his achievements, and his peace of mind from his immediate situation. This did not make him passive or resigned. Even in captivity, he continued analyzing situations, making plans, and looking for opportunities. But these activities flowed from his essential nature rather than from desperate need to restore his former position. He remained strategically engaged while emotionally detached, caring about outcomes while not being dependent on them. The transformation from ordinary man to unshakable foundation cannot be rushed or achieved through mere intellectual understanding. It requires years of deliberate practice, systematic self-examination, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths about one's dependencies and weaknesses. Most men never undertake this work because it requires temporarily feeling worse about themselves, recognizing their current limitations and dependencies, before they can feel genuinely better through authentic transformation. But, for the man who completes this journey, the rewards are profound. He achieves a form of freedom that no external power can touch. His decisions flow from authentic choice rather than unconscious compulsion. His relationships become genuine expressions of care rather than desperate attempts to fill psychological voids. His actions become strategic and effective because they are not distorted by emotional reactivity or ego needs. Most importantly, he becomes truly dangerous to those who would manipulate or control others, because he cannot be threatened with the loss of things he does not psychologically need, nor tempted with the promise of things he does not desperately want. He has become, in the deepest sense, ungovernable by any power except his own consciously chosen principles. In the end, Machiavelli's greatest insight was not about political tactics or strategic manipulation, but about the fundamental nature of power itself. True power is not the ability to control others, that is merely influence, and influence is always temporary and dependent on circumstances. True power is the complete self-governance that makes external control unnecessary and ultimately impossible. The man who has destroyed his weak self and built an unshakable foundation has achieved something far more valuable than dominion over others. He has achieved dominion over himself, and, in doing so, has become truly free. When such a man moves through the world, others instinctively recognize his strength not because he dominates them, but because he so clearly dominates himself. This recognition creates a natural authority that requires no enforcement and generates a respect that cannot be demanded. He has become living proof that it is possible to transcend the ordinary limitations of human weakness and achieve something approaching invincibility, not through external conquest, but through internal mastery. This is the ultimate teaching hidden within Machiavellian thought, that the highest form of power is not political but personal, not external but internal, not the domination of others but the complete self-possession that makes such domination unnecessary. The man who achieves this transformation may or may not rule kingdoms, but he will certainly rule himself, and, in a world full of men who are slaves to their own weaknesses, the man who has achieved genuine freedom will always find himself in a position of natural leadership, whether he seeks it or not. The marble corridors of history echo with the footsteps of men who understood this truth and shaped their worlds accordingly. Some left behind empires that crumbled with their deaths. Others left behind ideas that outlived civilizations. But all shared the common understanding that external power begins with internal mastery, and that the man who would be truly unshakable must first be willing to destroy everything within himself that can be shaken. In this destruction lies not annihilation but transformation, the emergence of something stronger, more real, and ultimately more powerful than what came before.